I asked for that music. Good afternoon, my name is Michael Chui. I'm a partner in the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey & Company's research arm. I sometimes describe my job as being a private sector professor. So instead of graduate students, I have much more motivated McKinsey consultants coming to join me. One of the joys of having this role is being able to step back a little bit and look at these broad trends which are affecting both the startup community as well as a number of your customers, whether they be particularly large companies, which we serve or have served for many years, but increasingly are serving some startups as well as individuals. So I want to step back and just talk a bit about some of these trends. Now, none of these trends specifically are going to be ones that you haven't heard of before. So I am going to talk about things like frickin' flying robot. No, I'm not. Teleportation. No, not those. Actually, each of these, I think you'll say, okay, yeah, I knew that. But I think the point I'm going to try to make is the multiplicative impact of these technologies and these trends put together are incredibly powerful. And let me just illustrate that. Again, I have the joy of being able to open the aperture a little bit farther than the next couple of quarters. And I understand, look, if you're trying to make quarter, that's the thing that you've got to do. But I think being able to step back is actually quite powerful. If I think about the impact of some of these technology trends, does anyone know how long it took for GDP per capita to double during the Industrial Revolution in the UK? About 150 years. And it affected about 10 million people. Now, you think about the number of people that will be affected by these technologies now. If you add up China, India, and the rest of the developing world, call it about 3 billion people. And now the ability to double GDP per capita, we can do it, or we've seen it happen in China and in India, in, say, about 15 years. So we went from 150 years, 10 million people, to something like 3 billion people in 15 years. I should have said 150 years, right? Basically, you could argue that some of these trends are affecting the world 3,000 times more impactfully than what happened during the Industrial Revolution. So again, what does this mean? I'll just narrow the aperture a little bit, one step at a time. Again, if you look at the large companies in the world, and here's at least one metric of it, who's in the S&P 500 in the United States, similar trends in Europe, similar trends around the world, and how long does a company last on average in these indices, right? You grow, you get in, and then stuff happens, right? What we find is these technologies increase the competitive intensity in every industry. By the way, it increases the competitive intensity amongst individuals as well. And what the sum total impact of that, right? Joseph Schumpeter type stuff. Basically, companies spend fewer and fewer years in the S&P 500. Let's double click again on this with regard to fast growing companies. Let's go from we started with the big companies and went to the small ones. What happens to the small companies, all the entrepreneurs who are here, who aspire to be, let's call these not billion dollar valuation, billion dollar revenue companies, right? Again, we've studied thousands of these over time, and the funnel shrinks very, very quickly, right? And that's, look, I have tremendous respect for all of you who have the ability to have the vision and drive towards this. But what we're showing here is that these trends, these technologies increase competitive intensity, increase turbulence, and increase the degree to which failures happen, which are good things, and the pace at which companies can grow. So that all said, is this a bug or a feature, right? And with my teams, I always say, look, any bug that you see in the world, right, which is that it's hard to get here or companies fall out quickly, you turn it around into a feature because these are not opportunities. Another way to put it, right, are these things weapons or are they tools?
We need to make sure that they understand the difference between a weapon and a tool. Language is messy and sometimes one can be both.
Okay, it's always good throwing a little movies. Let's talk about some of these trends now. First of all, again, network effects are incredibly, incredibly powerful, right? And we have these laws named after them, right? So, we've seen Moore's Law is fun, but Metcalfe's Law is another one, right? Every time you add an incremental user, an incremental, add node to the network, it increases the power of the entire network. And again, you say, okay, wow, the math is fun, that's cool. But seriously, if you think about any of the companies that have been successful in the past 10, 15, 20 years, can you think of any of them? Can you think of a microphone that did not take essential control of network effects, or at least leverage them in a powerful way? And so again, that's trend number one. The technology works one at a time. Secondly, if you think about the networks themselves, what are they made up of? When you have primary control, we called it audience on this slide, but we actually mean either customers or connections with end users. Again, if you think the flip side of that is whether or not you're disintermediated, right? Which a lot of the incumbents are worried about. But when you actually have control of the channel, you can greatly increase it, right? And so all of these are multiplicative effects. If you think of the impact of network plus audience, you see an increasing explosion in potential. By the way, we see that in the large companies as well, right? When they make an acquisition, the power of being able to have that account control and accelerate revenue growth is quite considerable. And then software is eating the world. Again, if you look at the fundamental economics of software, whether it's zero marginal cost, the ability to scale quickly, and increasingly, right? I mean, this shows just what the power of the software business model is, right? We looked at every single subsector in the entire economy. And some of these are obviously negative economic value drivers. But software, huge outside increases in the economic potential. That's why the investment case is so powerful. But now when you see software starting to eat the rest of these industries, you can see the disruptive impact they have. And that's why a lot of these larger incumbents are both so worried but also see such great potential. Again, each of these are adding step by step. So then as a service software models or business models, again, if you think about the power of being able to switch from paying as a subscription, a lot of you have seen this happen already. But now when you move this on to all those other industries, and we sometimes talk about this as putting yourself on the same side of the table as your customer. Because when you can change the commercial arrangements, when you change the commercial arrangements from, give me some dollars, give me some euro, and I'll give you, well, what, right? A hunk of metal if you want a car, or a jet engine, or apparel. Instead of selling a product, changing it to selling it as a service, but not just selling it as a service, right? Not just an on-demand consumption-based model, but increasingly, right, where you start to, what you're actually selling is the either business outcome or value. Right? And we saw this in advertising, right? It was cost per click, and then increasingly cost per conversion. But now we're seeing outcomes, for instance, rather than selling some fertilizer, I'm going to actually sell an increase in yield. And so when you couple as a service with value-based pricing, you only get rewarded when your customer gets rewarded. And that's incredibly powerful from the customer perspective. And then the essential power of data. We wrote a report on big data 6 years ago now. But we're truly starting to see this become a basis of competition, the effective use of data. Andrew Ng, some of you might know, right? So he was the co-founder of Google Brain, became the chief scientist at Baidu. Now he's come back to the States to do some more education work. But he told me that essentially the thing that distinguishes, let's call them AI companies, companies that are taking artificial intelligence seriously, from those that aren't, are number one, a more centralized approach to data. That doesn't necessarily mean everything's all in one data lake, but just a more centralized approach to it. But perhaps more importantly, they are playing multi-year, multi-dimensional chess games in acquiring the data that's going to be the basis of their competitive advantage going forward. And I'll tell you from talking to lots and lots of corporate executives that there are very few who think about data that way. And again, if you need to worry about this month or payroll for the next quarter, understand that. But also understand that there are competitors out there who are, again, playing these multi-year chess games and trying to understand how they can gain access to the data that will be the basis of their competition going forward. And then again, mobile, and I'll extend this farther, right, to Internet of Things. we've talked about this for so long, and you're right, companies have said, I've gone on from being mobile first. But I'll point out again, there are maybe 3 billion mobile phones in the world, and that's yet to be half of all the people who live in the world. So we're barely there. And then if you add all the devices that come with IoT, we just have a lot farther to go. Finally, security. Look, we could go on and on and on about all of the headlines that are going on here. I'll just observe that there is no company in the world, no industry in the world, no government in the world that seems to have invested either enough or in the right way to keep these things from happening. So are these things tools or are they weapons? They're both. What are the things that you have to do? First of all, just tick through all of those 7 and think about the multiplicative effect that they might have. Make sure you keep your aperture wide enough to know, look, you can focus on any one of these at a time, but the width of them is incredibly important. The breakdown company silos, I think, is more important for the big companies than it is for the little ones, but that's also an opportunity for you if you're selling to a large company. And then, look, we talk about pivoting but again, what these trends show is that, in fact, when competitive intensity increases, the importance of being flexible, agile, and resilient increases as well. Thank you very much.